website where people can share their stories, and I am really amazed. I've actually, reading about some of the experiences that people have had, I really have become more and more convinced that converts really hold the key to the future of our faith. And I think if people read some of these stories, they'll be surprised. I mean, I think a lot of people have had very similar experiences, a lot of struggles, a lot of hard times, a lot of very amazing inspiration. And I think that, if people see this, they'll get a very strong sense of the divine in this process. So what we actually have on the website is a section where we've asked 4 questions. And the first question is, just to share whatever they feel comfortable about their, how they came to be interested in Islam, and then how they ultimately converted. And then the second question is, how long have you been a convert? And then the third question is, what do you wish that you had known, either in the conversion process, or upon converting, or even long after you converted. And then the fourth thing is, what wisdom would you like to share from your experience, whether it's with other converts or born Muslims or even non-Muslims. And surprisingly, within even posting it up, I got a response within the first 24 hours, which really blew my mind. So we put it up there, and I've reached out to all of my amazing convert friends to please share their stories. If you have not heard from me, you will. So please do feel free. I think that it's really an amazing insight. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So, and I figured since I'm asking people that I know to share their stories, the least I can do is also reciprocate by sharing a little bit more about my story. And I've done that, thankfully, in the first 2 halaqas, but I'm going to add a little bit more. So I really, part of the reason why I think conversion is so interesting is that I really believe that given how, in the time that we live, it's truly miraculous that, people still convert. And I've had born Muslims say to me, I don't really know how it is that people even convert, because there's so many obstacles and so many reasons not to, but they still do. And that actually, from the stories that I've read, and even from my own story, I think what it actually takes is a little bit of a divine miracle and a little bit of a divine intervention. And I'm not talking about like a burning bush talking to you, but something that happens in your life that is so personal and so specific that you feel like it is really directed at you. And it's almost like something that happens that, whether you see something wherever you are, or you read something, or you hear something, maybe 10 other people that are with you would hear that same thing and it wouldn't register at all, but you feel it like this was sent just for me. And if you understand that and you accept it, it's a really important part of that process. So I wanted to share with you my story, because that did happen in my case as well. So I had mentioned to you that I became interested in Islam when I was getting my MBA at Cornell University. And the first thing I did was I went to the library and checked out a book called Religion of Islam by Maulana Muhammad Ali from the Ahmadiyyas, but I didn't know anything other than, it was a good general book. And I got into, I'd reached a point, I had said it previously in my life, where I was starting to question my purpose, and I wanted to reconnect with God. I had always believed in God, but it had been many, many years since I had actually talked to God or even had God really be a part of any, of my reality of my day. So I kind of settled into a habit of going to bed and reading a little bit of my book and thinking about it, and then just sort of starting the process of talking to God. And it was sort of fascinating because as I was reading the book, one, I was completely blown away that what I was reading was exactly what I had always believed. It was very intuitive to me, and that was shocking, because I think you always assume that Islam is just something so foreign. But when I actually started reading about how, the theology is about believing in the one God, and all of the beautiful things like helping other people, and it just was really surprising to me. So on the one hand, it was like, okay, that's very interesting. Simultaneous to that, I would start talking to God, and a little bit ashamed because it had been so long since I had, really talked to God, and I was not necessarily proud of some of the things that I had done in my life, so I was, a little bit like, well, I don't know what's going to happen. Is this going to lead to anything? And so this went on for probably a few months, I don't know, 6 months, something like that, and I felt like I was just talking to the wall, out into space, nothing at all. So, but I kept doing it, and then I remember one night I had gone out to the bar with my classmates in business school, typical like networking kind of evening, people go out and they hang out and talk and whatever. And for whatever reason, something must have happened that night where I came home and I was extremely depressed, and I felt really lost and so sad. And I remember climbing into bed and grabbing my pillow and crying and feeling like just this depression. If you've ever felt depression where you just feel this emptiness in your stomach and it's like nothing can fill it. And you just feel like, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. I can't eat enough ice cream. I can't, there's nothing that I can do. So I was calling out to God, and I just was like, please help me. I feel so lost, and I don't know what I'm doing. And literally in an instant, just to emphasize this point again, when you're that depressed, usually you have to sleep, call your parents, call your friends, take some time. But in an instant, that feeling went away. I had like nothing, no emptiness in my stomach. I was at peace, and I sat up, and it was like late at night, and it was quiet, and I was like, what just happened? And then I felt in my heart sort of the message of keep going, you're on the right track. And it wasn't like I was hearing voices, I just felt that. And part of what I was confronting as I was reading about Islam and thinking about, is it possible that I could be a Muslim, was I would always have in the back of my mind, oh, come on, you're crazy. There's no way you're going to convert to Islam. What do you think? You're not a Muslim. What are you going to tell your family? What are you going to tell your friends? There's just, you're ridiculous. But I would always come back and I would read. But that was my obstacle, is I could not get past the idea that I was crazy. So when this happened, that obstacle was actually removed from me. And I felt like it was such a direct message that it was like, okay, you're not crazy. But at the same time, it was the first time that I felt like God heard me. Like up until then, I could have just been, talking to a tree and there was like nothing going on. But I felt, and it wasn't like, okay, welcome my child, come back to me. It wasn't like that. It was more like, okay, you have my attention and I'm listening. So let's see what you do. And that's the best way I can articulate it. It all was just what I felt in my heart, but it was an important moment, and I felt that it was like a divine, kick to just go, okay, you're on the right track, let's see what you do. So that was one story. Then jump ahead a year. I graduated now from business school. It's my second story. And I moved to Princeton, New Jersey. I was working, in brand management at Johnson & Johnson, very long days. I would pretty much just go to work and come home, go to bed, and get up and do the same thing again. And didn't know anybody. And I felt like, okay, I really would like to just connect. And, so I researched and I found an adult school class at Princeton, about Islam. So it was like my one distraction. Like every Monday night I would go to this class, and it was about Islam, organized by someone in the community who would bring in different speakers, and every week you would go in and they would talk to you about some different aspect of Islam. And so interestingly, I never missed a class except one. And that one class, Dr. Abou El Fadl was the speaker. So it was sort of interesting because we kind of figured this out later, and it was like if we had met at that time, we would not have connected. It just wouldn't have worked. But so that was a little bit of, like, okay, divine intervention. But so anyway, continuing on the story, after a few sessions, I went up after class and talked to the instructor, and I said, I'm really interested in Islam. I've been studying for a couple of years, and I was just curious to know if there are any other classes or any other activities or ways that I could meet Muslims. And he was a really nice man, and his eyes lit up, and I was like, who is this Asian woman that's interested in Islam? And he was like, okay, well, I'm going to ask someone to come talk to you at the next class who, he's well known in the community. He likes speaking to young people, and he's very knowledgeable, and, I'll have him come talk to you after class next time. So I'm like, okay, great, thank you. So I came to the class, and sure enough, he came. And afterwards, he came up to me, and he said, I understand you're interested in Islam. I'm like, yes. And I told him his background. And he said, well, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? And I said, no, sure. And he said, okay, well, do you believe in one God and only one God? And I said, yes. And do you believe in, all of the books and the message from, Christianity and Judaism, that those are all from God? Yes. Did you believe in all the prophets and the angels and the scriptures of God? Yeah, I do. And do you believe that Jesus is not the Son of God, but a prophet of God? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, do you believe that the Prophet Muhammad was the last prophet of God? And I said, yeah, actually I do. And he was like, congratulations, you're a Muslim. And it's Ramadan, so tomorrow you should start fasting. So I did. And that was how I converted. I had no intention of converting. I was, perfectly happy just believing that Islam was the truth, and, I was just doing my life as normal. But that was what I needed to just cross the finish line. And so the next day I started fasting, and then shortly after that I went to the mosque for the very first time in my life. I'd only known maybe a few Muslims. And, through that process, I met, some nice people, but this is now a whole other story. So last week I talked about how hard it is to kind of, be open to the idea of being Muslim. Then the second phase being, okay, what does it actually take to cross the finish line and convert? And then the next phase is, okay, now what? What do you do? And, and sort of an expectation. So, this is something important that I want to convey to, born Muslims to understand this experience, and especially if you grow up in America, you go through all of this upending of your life. You've put a lot of time and effort and prayer and thought, and, you're thinking about what you have to sacrifice, and you say, okay, I did it. So now I'm a Muslim. And it's like, okay, now what do I do? Where do I go? I'm going to go meet my people. So I go to the mosque, and, you have an expectation that, maybe someone will be there to welcome me, someone will be there to show me the way, tell me what to do, and none of that happened. You confront the reality of the mosque. And people were nice, and they were like, oh, great, welcome, and then they would scurry off. Or there was one family that was a really nice Egyptian family, and they invited me to dinner, and so I was very happy to go, and they were very welcoming, and I had the expectation that I would go in and we'd be talking about religion, and that this would be really wonderful, that we'd pray together and we could talk about these great issues about meaning of life and purpose and all of that. And then very quickly discovered, no, they were just, prayer was, yeah, sure, we pray, whatever, and they were just kind of going on with their life as they normally do, and doing what normal people do. They work, and religion was really not part of their life. So there was a lot of disconnect between my expectation and the reality. And, this is kind of what I want to talk about, because I think that when God takes the time to give you sort of a divine intervention at a personal level and says, okay, maybe you should be Muslim, and you actually do it and you put so much into it, then what happens when you arrive? And you have to start thinking, well, why am I Muslim? Why was I chosen or special? Or why did this happen to me? And what do I do with that? And so these stories that people have shared with me have really validated the same experience. They go to the mosque, they don't necessarily feel welcome. People are nice. They don't really recognize anything familiar because the people inside the mosque don't necessarily reflect the people that you see outside of the mosque. Because the inside, it might be an ethnic, mosque. So you see a lot of Arabs, you see a lot of, Pakistanis, you see a lot of Egyptians, whatever, but it's not necessarily, especially if you are not of that background, you're not going to feel like you fit in. And some of the people who have written me have said that they're like, I'm a white dude and I look like a cop, and the African American brothers don't really want me to be there. And, so this is an opportunity, and it's something we have to think about, because these are very special, people that are coming, and they have an expectation that they can, they're ready to learn, they're ready to do stuff. And what do we as Muslims do to welcome that? And, embrace them and help them reach their full potential. Which leads me then to another one of my favorite stories about when so then after I spent a year or something, just kind of hanging out and trying to understand the difference between, what I'm seeing and experiencing, and, I'm going to classes and things, and I'm hearing things that are a little bit strange and backwards and not like what I had studied about. And then I mentioned that someone sent me the lecture tapes for Dr. Abou El Fadl, and I was like, oh, this is why I came to Islam. And then I called him and asked him if he was teaching classes. So aside from the comment I said last time about, you need to be either converts or either brilliant or insane, the second thing he said to me is, well, I don't know if I should share the bad news with you about Muslims now. And I had no idea what he meant by bad news about Muslims, but now I do. And it's just, not that people are bad or anything, it's just we're not equipped to really take advantage of helping those. So why is this important? Why are converts so important? I think very simply, we're from here, we're from American culture. We have a certain expectation of equality and justice and fairness and, equal rights for women. And we have a whole history of what America should stand for. And that's very powerful when you start with that base. If you have that expectation and then you overlay the beauty of the Islamic tradition, you've got a very powerful combination. And I think handled right, that can be amazing. So now, fast forward to, I'm getting these stories from people around the country, around the world. Imagine if you put those people together. And, that can really be amazing. So to go back to the 4 questions that I posed on the website. So I told you a little bit about my story. How long have I been a convert? So I converted March 1st, 1994. So I'm going to be coming up on my 24-year anniversary as a Muslim, and very proud of that. What do I wish I had known in the conversion process? I wish I had known that the reality on the ground, it will not meet your expectation. And that Muslims don't always hold the key to this faith. And that you have every right to claim this tradition as your own, even though you're a convert. It's yours just as much as someone who was born into the religion, if not more so, because you've put in the effort, you've made the sacrifice. And, you have a right to say what's on your mind. And, one of the stories that someone shared with me, and this is a really interesting, and he gave me his permission to share this story with you, is that he first became aware of the professor's writings in high school, right after 9/11. And he was, very taken by the ideas and fascinated, and over the years continued to read, and he, was raised in a Christian background. And it wasn't until 15 years later that he was diagnosed with cancer, where he felt like God was literally grabbing him by the shirt collar and saying, okay, enough of this. He didn't want to convert. He liked them, he believed that it was truthful. He knew that, okay, I believe that Jesus is is a prophet of God and not the son of God, so I know I'm not Christian. But he liked pork, he liked drinking, he liked, un-Islamic behaviors. And he said, well, if I don't convert, I'm not a hypocrite. So it took him getting cancer and feeling through his own divine message, you got to make a decision. And he did, and he just converted about a month ago. So that, these stories are like, oh my God, So, and then another thing that he mentioned was when he went to the mosque and he joined one of the Islam 101 classes, he was quiet and listening, and he was mentioning that there was someone, a couple there, and he was listening to whoever was conducting the class talk about Islamic history and issues of, I don't know what exactly, but his reaction was, no, talk about justice and peace and beauty and love. This is what you should be talking about. But he didn't want to appear like the know-it-all new convert, so he was quiet. And then he left and he started questioning, should I have said something? Should I have been quiet? And so I'm here to tell you, yes, it's your faith. You have every right, and you should. Because if you recognize that this is something that people need to hear, you have every right to speak up. And that's what I mean when I say, empowering converts. Letting them not feel like, just because you're new, that you don't have a right to say it. But I understand it, because that's very classic for converts. You're new, you don't want to say anything, you're just trying to figure it out, and that's okay. So my last 4 questions. Last question: what wisdom would you like to share? And I have to say that I prayed before coming here, and I always pray because I always get nervous talking in front of people, and I'm like, please God, don't let me embarrass myself, let me say something interesting and that is of value. And oftentimes I get something in my heart where I'm like, okay, how do I finish out what I want to say? So I did, I felt like, okay, here's what you need to say, is that it's no accident that you're a convert, or it's no accident that, and maybe it's not even just a convert, because I think this also applies to people who maybe were not that connected to their faith. They were born Muslim, but they, for whatever reason, really were not religious, but they later in their life decided that I want to embrace this faith, and they do the work as if they're a convert. I mean, so, I on the website, we refer to it as a modern day first Muslim, because it's really like kind of starting again and doing the work to really say, yes, I'm committed to this faith. And so it's no accident, and there is a purpose, and I do believe that. And secondly, it's not about ego. I'm not saying that converts should now just go and take over the mosques, and it's like, okay, this is the future. Every convert should just rise up, and I mean, although that's fine if that's what's necessary, but that's not the point. The point is not about ego. It's about testifying. It's about testifying to your truth and testifying to your story, and figuring out. Why was I put in this situation? What is my purpose? What is my gift? What am I going to share? What can I do to contribute? And, one of the things that, just to throw an idea, as I'm going to finish on this last idea, is, I always wonder, why is it that Muslims have not put together, like, best practices for an American mosque? Like, every business, every organization, every industry, every school, every university has standards of best practices. So I know if I walk into a mosque, I want to feel welcome. I want to have, it be beautiful and clean and inviting, and someone at the front greeting you and, hello, welcome. Are you a Muslim? Oh, you're not a Muslim? You've never been? Let me show you around. Let me tell you what we do here. Let me tell you about the faith. And just, if someone going through that process, it's like customer service, right? And it's like, what do you want people to feel? Even if you're not Muslim, even if you're not interested in Islam, maybe you're in danger and you need shelter. Maybe you're an addict and you just want someone to give you a purpose for living, that you should feel welcome in this space. We will help you. Even if you're not Muslim, we have no expectation of you becoming Muslim. We are here just to serve. That would be beautiful, and making that available to mosques around the country. So we have a standards committee or a checklist or whatever it is, the way we do it in business, the way we do it in schools. I mean, why can't we do that in mosques? And that's what I think converts can really also bring to, because they're coming at it, you come in and you want to be able to see everyone. It doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter what skin color, what you look like. And I think that's the expectation that American values plus Islamic values can bring to the table. So, thank you.
First, I'm very grateful to all those who dialed in, and especially the poor people who are staying up. Although, staying up the night in a state of dhikr is a secret to so much knowledge, and so much awareness. So you're doing a good thing, inshallah. Again, there is so much that we could talk about, but I'm going to take off a little bit from where Grace left off. And it's an interesting in perhaps understated way situation that we find ourselves in. I remember in the 80s, where there was a persistent mantra repeated by so many of the Orientalists and publicists, and something that seems that Muslims, in an egotistical fashion, were quite pleasant about, quite happy with, and that's the mantra of the Islam, the fastest growing religion in the world. And you heard that all the time. That Islam, the fastest growing religion in the world. Now, even back then, it sounded, if you think about it, it was not said as a sociological fact, but more as an element of propaganda, as if Islam, the fastest growing religion in the world, is evidence that we must pay attention to this phenomena of Islam. Now, often what it was referring to was Muslim birth rates, which is a remarkably racist comment and colonialist observation, as if the fact that Muslims have a high birth rate presents the world was a phenomena that the world must react to in a systematic and consistent fashion. What was unarticulated and not explicitly said became articulated and became explicit was the explosion of Islamophobia. In other words, the mantra that Islam is the fastest religion in the world betrayed a clear sense of apprehension and fear about the role that Islam would play in a post-Cold War era and a post-colonial era. And Islamophobia simply articulated the anxiety and the apprehension that was not explicitly said in the mantra of Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. The reality, though, is that at least in the 80s and perhaps as we enter the 90s, Muslims were still, and I'm talking about Muslims in the West in particular, were still had enough of a sense of identity and a sense of self-worth to aspire to educate and share their faith with others in Western countries. One of the very interesting, and it's remarkably told, one of the stories I'll share with you, and remember, this is before Islamophobes appeared on the scene with all their resources and all their institutions and so on. Two things. I worked at one point closely, I was at Princeton and I worked closely where Bernard Lewis was and where Avram Yudovich was, and Daniel Pipes was a student of Bernard Lewis. And one of the things that I overheard in two separate occasions, Bernard Lewis tended to, when he would get invited to departmental parties, he would drink a bit too much. And when he drinks, he gets tipsy. And when he gets tipsy, and I had a car, and at that time I drove, and I would drive him to the party at a friend's house and drive him back home. And then at home he would brag about his library, and he had a very interesting collection of memorabilia and historical material from artifacts from the Muslim world. Anyway, you sort of get tipsy and become loose-tongued, let loose and say a lot of things. He hated Edward Said with a passion. He would always go off on Edward Said. But one of the things he mentioned was that he wrote his book on Islam and slavery in order, as a direct response to his concern about the spread of Islam among African Americans. And he wrote his book about Muslims and anti-Semitism, it's called Semites and Anti-Semites, in direct response to his concern about the spread of Islam in Western countries. And what he would often do is, instead of articulating, because he had a certain scholarly persona that he had to maintain, he would unleash Daniel Pipes to say things in a politicized fashion rather than the scholarly language that he maintained. This experience and the rise of Islamophobia was quite impactful. I mean, and required a lot of attention. Because it's coupled with a phenomena that I want to just comment on and we could talk about later, and it deserves study. I mean, again, if the Usuli Institute becomes a vehicle for discoursing upon the undiscoursed or articulating the unarticulated, challenging institutions of power as they exist and institutions of inequity and injustice, then it's a imperative that at the same time that Europe and the West generally engaged Muslims in an anxiety-producing discourse of Islamophobia, where Muslims went largely on the defensive, worried about assuring the West that they are not a threat and allaying the anxieties of the West. I want to draw your attention to something that is quite remarkable, and that is, as we are told consistently by the West that you must prove you are committed to secularism and that you are secularists and that you are not Islamists in order to assimilate, in order to fit in. Well, guess what? In the age of secularism, there has been, and in the age of selling us the mantra of Islam is the fastest growing religion, there has been a persistent effort to Christianize the world. Think about that. We are told we are living in a post-religious world. Fancy, hip Muslims love to say, we're post-religion. Well, in the age of post-religion, look at the institutions that work to Christianize the world we live in. Now, note, the United States, when it occupied the Philippines, although the United States is a secular country and there ought to be separation of church and state, and this is a story that's not, that historians need to investigate because it is explosive and shocking. The United States, contrary to its own constitution and its own legislation on foreign policy, facilitated the Christianization of the Philippines in ways that are remarkable. The facilities that the U.S. government provided to various evangelists and Christian groups to spread Christianity into the Philippines. The same happened in Japan. Japan is no longer a Buddhist country. It's a Christian country, increasingly. The same has happened in Taiwan. The same has happened in South Korea. The same is happening in China. While China is increasingly persecuting Muslims and not allowing them to practice their religion, China politically cannot stem the spread of Christianity because of the pressure that Western governments are placing on China to allow the spread of Christianity in China. The same is happening in Africa. The spread of Christianity in Africa is unprecedented. My point is that it is the Muslims as a defeated civilization has gotten in the habit of accepting the historical narratives of others as prepackaged and not initiating their own historical inquiries and their own sociological inquiries and their own political inquiries. And if they get beyond the apologetics of trying to simply allay the fears of others, maybe they can start noticing some compelling things about the world we live in. Globalization and the Trump administration is not an accident. While Trump is not a religious person, and in my view is not even a Christian person, but that does not mean that as in the age of colonialism, the world, the West, tends to see a certain articulation of Christianity as conducive to the spread of Western influence. Now, why am I saying this? Because exactly what Grace is talking about, our ability to, and again, this is against my intuitive nature, because my intuitive nature, I'm not an evangelist, and I never expend much effort in trying to convince someone to become a Muslim or not become a Muslim. I'm so consumed with my own faults as a human being and my own shortcomings as a human being that I just want God to forgive my shortcomings. And that's what concerns me. I don't have the hubris to approach others and tell them, follow me, because I have the light. But at the same time, I know that I cannot allow this introspection to prevent me from testifying to what is just and what is truth. And what is just and what is truth is that what has happened to Islam in the West is extremely alarming, because it cannot be studied or understood in isolation from a larger international phenomena that is taking place in our day and age. While Muslims have accepted the reality of immigrant Islam, and it has become now the commonplace, unlike the 80s, it has become quite commonplace to have an Egyptian mosque, to have a Palestinian mosque, to have an Indonesian mosque, to have to have ethnic mosques. In other words, cultural centers. And Muslims are no longer sufficiently empowered to invite others to the truth that they have been blessed with. In fact, it's quite remarkable about the new generation of Muslims is that they are embarrassed about inviting others to the truth, embarrassed about the spread of their faith, and have completely bought into the notion that we exist in a post-religious order where, it is just impolite to try to spread your faith. But at the same time, they have been caught in a consistent paradox in which we hear quite a bit of talk about democracy and empowerment and liberation, but the reality of the sociological reality of Muslims is disempowerment and domination. while we hear a considerable amount of talk about human rights and dignity, the reality of Muslims is that they are denied human rights and dignity in a persistent fashion. The point that I'm focusing on now is that what we are told that secularism is the order of the day, and individual religion is an entirely private matter. That these are not the rules of the game by which the West actually lives by when it comes to dealing with the third world or the underdeveloped world or the other. There is a consistent effort to mold the other so that the other, will be unoffensive and unobtrusive upon the white consciousness. Does everyone follow what I'm saying? It's as if the white man, and here I say man quite intentionally, can only deal with the other as long as the other becomes as whiteized or approximates whiteism as much as possible. And this is why just the evangelical, if you study the amount of resources, the amount of money that is put into evangelism, whether by Protestant sects or the Catholic Church, your mind would be blown. We are talking about billions and billions of dollars. The spread of Christianity in Indonesia, in Malaysia, the consistent efforts to eradicate Muslims in non-Arab contexts, like China, like the Rohingyas, and so on, so that Islam can be limited to an foreign Arab phenomena, where it is easily demonized, easily racialized, and easily becomes the other. At the same time, we have been in the West sufficiently long now to expect that those who come to Islam out of conviction, not out of birth, to become a serious social and political force in our life. But they're not. And they're not because we alienate them with our cultural baggage and our insistence on our cultural baggage that we come from back home. They come to our Islamic centers, they find that they have really no place, and then they drift away. And they drift away in the cosmos. They're out there, whoever they are. We must wake up. We must wake up and study racial politics, study colonial politics, study the dynamics of power. When the Prime Minister of France tells Clinton about the Bosnian genocide, that France doesn't want to intervene to stop the Bosnian genocide because we must put a stop to the Islamization of the European continent. And this is in the Clinton diaries. I mean, Muslims just don't read. Bill Clinton put it in his diaries. This should have been a wake-up call for us. When we find that Europe, with all its talk about secularism, persistently demands of Muslims that they assure Europe that they are not a threat to European identity, regardless of what Europeans or Muslims continue saying again and again and again about how their religion is a religion of peace, that they believe in democracy, that they believe in pluralism, and so on. Ad nauseum, it's never enough. You can't ever say it enough. And, okay, we believe you, because ultimately, when all is said and done, as much as you say it, you say, well, you also believe in taqiyya. Muslims are liars by nature. So it's like the colonial project itself. The colonized could never become part of the power structure and could never appease the colonial agent, regardless of, and like the slave could never appease the master, regardless of how much the slave adopted the agenda of the master. There's a lot that, as usual, a lot that I want to say, but I don't like the lecturing, and I'd rather respond to questions. I'll end with this, and again, I'm a little bit disappointed because I had a lot to say about the theology itself, but maybe I'll postpone it for another halaqa so I don't talk too much. To me, a very powerful example of these power dynamics I'm talking about is the attempt, not just the persistent investment of resources. You always want to know whether Allah always gives victory to those who do their job, do their homework. Now, measure the amount of resources that are spent in the process of co-opting Islam and neutralizing Islamicity of its spirit, to the amount of resources invested in an independent assertion of Muslim autonomy by Muslims. So this little curious book came, that I actually mentioned it before, but it's an example of the type of offensive reality we live in. This is a book titled The Challenge of Modernizing Islam. Now notice the language, the deprecating language here. The challenge of modernizing Islam. Now, who are the modernizers? Zuhdi Jasser, Rahil Riza, Sheikh Ahmad Subhi Mansour, Tawfiq Hamid, Salim Mansour, Qanta Ahmed, Jalal Zubairi, Shireen Quddusi. These are the modernizers that are being challenged. Now, Christine Douglas Williams, the foreword for the book is by Daniel Pipes and Robert Spencer. Christine Douglas Williams interviews the people I mentioned, and then, this is the first half of the book, the second half of the book, part 2, is written by no other than Christine Douglas Williams. And here are the subtitles. Islam and Islamism, Identifying the Enemy. Moderates and Reformists, Problematic Islamic Texts, the Islamophobia Deception, the Israel Factor, Who Speaks for Muslims. The book, everything that is said by Christine Douglas Williams and Daniel Pipes and Robert Spencer is the typical Islamophobic garbage that we are accustomed to. But the difference is the invested resources in getting a group of Muslims to become native informants. In other words, natives that come in and say, look at our problems as oh, colonial master. Let us skip around and hop around and act like monkeys for your appeasement, just so we allay your anxieties about who we are, what our identity is, and what our race and ethnicity is. What bothers me, there are always native informants. In every culture, there are always people who have no dignity, like these Muslims who allow themselves to be in an Islamophobic garbage like this. They have no dignity, and I don't expect anything from them. But what bothers me is that as a book like this comes out, through the investment of resources, nothing on the other side, on the Muslim side, balances it. There are no investment of resources by Muslims. We have money, people, but we don't spend our money on the battles that matter in the world we live in. If you think we live in a post-religious world, do your homework, study. In fact, we live in a world in which Jews have invested all their resources in a historical paradigm called Israel to bring back the temple of Israel, something that is 2,000 or older years old, but that has become their share, their piece of the pie in the world we live in. Christians have formed a strange alliance with secular politics in which they've adopted the language of secularism but are systematically and energetically working to Christianize the underdeveloped world and the third world. Now, what is the share that Muslims are taking? Assuring the world that we're not terrorists? Is that our function? That's our role? Islam has instilled in me more dignity than this, more honor than this. I refuse to meet Allah, telling Allah, yes, I've watched, the Jews bring back the historical paradigm of Israel at the expense of Palestinians, at the expense of anyone that stands in their way. I've watched Christians Christianize the world through the mythology of someone died for your sins, so why don't you celebrate whoever died for your sins? While Islam, which I passionately believe is the truth for humanity, all of humanity, does nothing but simply say we are not terrorists. Okay, I'll stop here for today. That means that then we can deal with questions.
Okay. Did you want to address any other questions that came in before?
I don't remember them, so you have to remind me. They're here.
Yeah, you know what? Let's give. Let me reach out to the people in the UK because it's late for them there, and give you guys first dibs at questions. So if you want to either come on or send a message, please do. They say we'd rather he carry on.
Oh, really?
Maybe talk about the theology part that you wanted to talk about.
Should I talk about the theology part?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, good suggestion.
Okay. My friends, listen. Allah has left with us a real miracle. A miracle of a book that, my students know how many tafsirs I've read, how many tafsirs have been written. I've been studying this book for all my life, and I still feel like I'm bewildered by it, and I haven't even scratched the surface of anything. Allah, in a powerful way, tells us about two conditions that human beings are often swing back and forth between. Two mental states. We are often, as people, Ya'us Kafur or Farihun Fakhur. Human beings are often either despairing and ungrateful or jubilant and arrogant. As human beings, when we are not centered, when we are not rooted you find us between these two poles. We encounter hardship, and our anxieties and despair eat away at us to an extent that we lose a sense of balance about our place and the place of others. We encounter anxieties and fears. We even become so despairing that we hurt the society we live in and we hurt those we love because we become completely self-involved. That's a Ya'us Kafur. Then Allah bestows some good thing about us. You know, we get whatever we want in life. We become doctors. You know, we get our medical degree. We start making money. We do whatever. And we become pompous and idiotic fools. It's as if, now, between these two, Allah tells us in the Quran, وَهَذَا صِرَاطٌ مُسْتَقِيمٌ. Now this path is the path of anchoring, is the path by which you are able to balance yourself between these two erratic states. Of course, the question that immediately we think of, okay, yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, well, this is Sirat Mustaqim, this is a straight path, this is an anchor. But per what methodology? Per what process? If you allow the Quran to become your teacher, you discover such profound things. First, Allah warns you about the role of hawa, the role of whim. The dalala of the faultiness of whimsical, idiosyncratic, self-centered, self-referential psychology. Notice when Allah tells us that, and I'll say it in Arabic first and then translate. قل لا يستوي الخبيث والطيب ولو أعجبك كثرة الخبيث فاتقوا الله يا أولي الألباب. What is foul and what is good cannot be equal, even if what is widespread is foul. So in other words, as the Prophet ﷺ says, لا تكن إما, do not be a whimsical follower without a state of consciousness of your own. So the first step that is necessary for هذا صراط مستقيم is that you resolve within yourself that you don't simply follow the fashion. You resolve within yourself that you don't simply follow whatever is current, whatever is done by the majority. That you have an anchored, principled being, even if that will mean a very scary thing, and that's loneliness. Even if you have to persist through moments upon moments of loneliness. Now, so how do I unfold this process? Well, first, you must confess and admit and accept that if you live a life in which you believe in a supreme being, and that supreme being is Allah, that you admit and you realize and internalize and resolve to internalize that you are nothing and you can do nothing and you cannot be empowered without the support and the aid and the will of that supreme being. That's one. Two, if you truly accept that premise, that you are committed to the belief in that supreme being, and that your will is contingent upon the will of the supreme being, then you must accept that the supreme being is also, because again the Quran is your educator, that supreme being is intimately involved in your life and who you are. أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِمْ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ, that Allah is closer to you than the jugular vein. And that there aren't two without Allah being the third, and there aren't three without Allah being the fourth. That, as Allah tells you, every human being has a mu'aqqibat, has an accompaniment of celestial beings wherever they go, that carry out the will of Allah. Now imagine if you truly internalize this belief. Now if you truly internalize this belief, and you truly believe that, as Allah tells you, that the Sirat al-Mustaqim is al-amr bil-ma'ruf and nahy al-munkar, enjoining the good and forbidding what is bad, and upholding justice even if it's against yourself and your loved ones, then you also resolve to say that part of living with this supreme being is that I commit myself to the principle of justice wherever it is and wherever it goes. But you cannot observe justice unless your soul is ready to observe justice. Otherwise, a corrupt soul, a soul that is full of anxieties and fears, a weak soul, will always see everything through the prism of its own anxieties and fears. And therefore will always see things in a skewed fashion. Will always project upon others its own whims, its own help. So what is the first step? You resolve to confront yourself with all your ugliness and weakness. In AA, they make a list of, a list of your resentments. Well, in the Usuli method, the method of self-purification, you make a list of all the ways that you are unjust towards others and unjust towards yourself. You actually become consumed, not with the faults of others, but making lists of all the ways that you can be a better embodiment of what Allah expects you to be. And you address them point by point in a persistent state of jihad. Now, the empowering thing about this is that you start becoming you become impassioned and in love with the very idea and concept of justice in the world you live in. And when you become passionate about justice, you don't see things from the point of view of the powerful and the corrupt. You see things from the point of view of those who resist the powerful and the corrupt. But that's impossible without this process of self-cleansing and self-awareness and self-consciousness. When I see Muslims of our day and age, Trump moves the embassy to Jerusalem. We are steps away from losing the Aqsa Mosque people forever. We could be, the shame of a generation of Muslims who've lost the place where the Isra wal Mi'raj were, the first Qibla of Muslims, the symbol, our share, not our monopoly, but our share in the symbol of monotheism and Abrahamic monotheism. And I find Muslims sitting there on the net concerned with accusing each other of and speculating about the malfeasance by this person and that person. In other words, what do you call it? Backbiting, rumor mills. What is wrong with our consciousness? Where are we as human beings? When just new mass graves of Rohingyas have been slaughtered, and Rohingyas, by the way, are being absorbed in human trafficking and the sex trade in horrendous numbers. And I see nothing, and Muslims are far more interested in talking about, whether this imam did something improper or that imam did something improper, and what is wrong with our consciousness? Where are we? No, our religion deserves much more than that from us. And like Grace, I have much hope in those who come to this faith out of a sense of self-awareness, self-conviction, and belief in justice. But I wish that they would mobilize and make their voices heard. Because I'll tell you, this is the other thing I want to say. The earmark, that statement attributed to Umar ibn al-Khattab, where he says, ماذا استعبدتم الناس وقد ولدتهم أمهاتهم أحرارا, by what right do you enslave people and people have been born free? The reason Islam came to the people of Quraysh, the reason it was revealed in these people, because they were a people weaned on the idea of freedom. Unlike the Persians, unlike the Romans, they were not raised in despotism and subjugation. They were raised in a milieu of furusiyya, knightly honor. So Arabs, the early Arabs, would constantly talk about, each person would be so proud about being a knight and a savior and a person who stands up for honor. And in fact, these people, when empowered with Islam, conquered the Persian Empire and conquered the Roman Empire and spread Islam to the world. Modern day Muslims are like the Persians and Byzantines of early days. We are raised in subjugation and disempowerment. I mean, I don't want to offend any Egyptians, but what the heck? Look at the way, Sisi comes to power, gives Egyptians dictatorship, and all of them, oh, wonderful, we subjugate us. Oh Pharaoh, oh great God, we love to live in just tell us what to do in life because we don't want to think for ourselves. Well, these are defeated people. Cannot generate victory because they don't understand it. They don't understand the ethic of liberation. Converts who are raised in the United States at least are raised with the dignity of liberation, of freedom. When combined with the ethics of Islam, I believe it would be a very powerful force. And I believe that is why Islamophobia was created. Because at one point, there was intense anxiety about the number of conversions among African Americans and among whites in the 80s and 90s. And Islamophobia was directly a discourse that attempted to neutralize the effort to make Islam anything but an immigrant religion in the West. That's what the whole entire enterprise of Islamophobia. And I say this knowing the teacher of Daniel Pipes, knowing the conversations he had with Daniel Pipes, knowing the type of planning they did. It was all directed. When Daniel Pipes wrote his article, this is before the birth of Islamophobia, the Muslims are coming, it was because Bernard Lewis was sitting there with Daniel Pipes saying, what are we going to do about the rate of conversions among Muslims? We cannot have Muslims become anything but an immigrant religion in the West. In the case of Bernard Lewis and Daniel Pipes, what they worried about is that it would threaten Israel. In the case of Robert Spencer, what he's worried about is that it would threaten the spread of Christianity in places like China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. I cannot be more forward than this. I cannot be more honest than this. But we live in an age where we cannot afford not to be forward and honest about things and blunt about things. We can't kiss and dance around issues anymore. Okay, I spoke more than I wanted to.
Okay. Back to the UK. I know you guys have some questions there, and you need to go to bed soon. So, I'm going to ask a question for you that I know came up yesterday, if no one wants to come forward. Is Professor still there? Yes, sir, this is directed at you. Okay, you want me to ask, or do you have the question? Do you want to type your question?
They all fell asleep.
No, they didn't. Please ask. Okay, so this is a question about jinn and demons. And are they real? Feel free to add more if you want to ask more. Because there was a discussion about if they are real, if they do interact with people, about the world of the unseen, and the role of superstition and things like that. Fair enough? Yes? Yes. Okay.
Okay. We know that part of imaan, of faith, is that you believe in the alam al-shahada, the world of the seen, and alam al-ghayb, the world of the unseen. Now, it's fascinating because people 1,000 years ago were asked to believe in the world of the unseen before we even realized that there's anything like dark energy and dark matter. And please think about the fact that our material world is only 5% of existence. 95% of existence is dark matter or dark energy. Which is, it's so much easier today to believe in alam al-ghayb, the world of the unseen, than it was, and this is counterintuitive, but that's the truth. If you don't believe me, read some of the speculative physics and the mathematical physics about dimensions and the existence of dimensions and how many dimensions exist. Now, I have to believe in jinn first because, as a matter of faith, the Quran says there are jinn. And as there are malaika, they're angels. And the Quran furthermore tells me that at some point, it is believed that at the time of the Prophet Sulaiman, that some people actually would seek the aid of jinn, and the Quran comments very powerfully, فَزَادُوهُمْ رَهَقًا, that it's not that the jinn didn't help them, the jinn did indeed help them, but at the same time dominated them. And I'll tell you from the study of history, when I look at some black magic practices, and especially the horrifying practice of human sacrifice, I always remember that Quranic verse, فَزَادُوهُمْ رَهَقًا, that people can become as if possessed by something. Now, demons, the idea of shayateen, is not only jinn. A shaitan, a demon, can be either human or jinn. They cannot be an angel, they cannot be malak. And contrary to Christian theology, where an angel can be fallen, we have nothing in Islam that tells us angels have the willpower that would allow them to become fallen. But humans and jinn, we are told by the Quran that they do have the willpower. Now, either human or jinn can become a shaitan, can become a demon. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean a human being with supernatural powers? Not necessarily. It just means that they have become a shaitan, is someone who has strayed from any possible centering of sirat, of equity, that their entire being no longer recognizes the equity that others are entitled to. In other words, a shaitan, by definition, is in a constant state of aggression against the other. And that could be a human being or a jinn. I mean, if you've ever... I'll tell you now, having said this, I'll now tell you some creepy stuff. It is amazing to me that we live in a day and age where non-Muslims have had enough of an objective distance to try to invent devices that capture the paranormal. Things like EVP and whatever other machines that they use to capture things that science cannot explain. Shadow figures, what they call shadow men. From my perspective, all of what is captured, everything that I've seen or read, it can nicely fits within the realm of jinn violating the laws of God in interacting with human beings, although after we read in theological works that after Sulaiman they were ordered, or the Prophet Sulaiman sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that they were ordered not to interact with human beings. Inequitable jinn do interact with human beings and play around with their minds. So if you are a pious Muslim, you wouldn't fool around with the jinn. But they exist. And I don't want to, I mean, my own personal experience is something else, but you don't fool around with this topic. You just, and those who do open a door that is very dark. Does that answer it?
Any follow-up questions from anybody over there or anyone here? It's just a lot of... And again, we emphasize that there's no embarrassment in religion, so you can feel free.
I mean, it's quite remarkable that part of what Islam empowers you with is that I think, and this is what I hope all of you would do, think on your own, observe, learn on your own. I don't care what the majority says and what the public says. I don't, I have built a reputation as a rationalist jurist, but my rationalism does not blind me to investigate all the evidence wherever I find it. So I've read tons of books about the paranormal, and I've read tons of books about occult practices and realize the extent that they are evil and that they can do an enormous amount of damage to human beings. As a Muslim, being anchored in Allah empowers me to venture into realms of investigation and thought and inquiry while always being centered. And Muslims should be more, as my teacher Muhammad al-Ghazali used to say, the fact that we live in a day and age in which Muslims are not at the forefront of inquiry and investigation in all fields is a shame. Why is it that non-Muslims can invent machines that would try to capture the paranormal, while we Muslims, we don't invent anything. We don't even invent a concerto of music. We seem to just be consumed with holding on to our Islam, but that's not enough. We must be secure in our faith and confront the world bravely, because we possess the truth, the liberating truth.
I have some questions I can ask, but if anyone has any.
And yes, I have had paranormal experiences, by the way.
Yes, please.
What do you expect of the average person such as us in combating, today's academia or non-academia for that reason, to do, to help the situation?
Okay, this is a very good question. And people, have sometimes find it hard to believe that this is all it takes, but I mean every word I say. One, develop the attitude that the secret taught by so many great theologians and so many great spirits, that you want to know God, know yourself. That's one. Two, once you try to internalize this, you internalize the reality that whatever is given to you not because you're entitled to it, but is given to you as a trust by God. Everything given to you is a trust by God. Your money, your job, your family, your health. And because it's a trust, God is going to ask you, what have you done with it in the final day? So if God gave you money, then your trust to invest this money to empower those that God has given the talent of research, or the talent of eloquence, or the talent of reason, or the talent of philosophy. In other words, to empower the other. There is no shame in how did the sciences flourish? How did the arts flourish? It was so through patrons. A patron of such and such. People without patrons, talent is dead. I've often, after I would listen to Bach, for instance, I would often think to myself, how many Muslim Bachs were born and were never discovered because there are no patrons of music in the Muslim world? I am sure there have been tons of Bachs and Mozarts in the Muslim world. There have been tons of Kants and Nietzsche and philosophers in the Muslim world, but there were no patrons. So they were probably born, raised, died, no one ever heard of them. So that's one thing. The other thing, let's assume that you don't have money, and let's assume that you don't have the ability to write or lecture. If you focus on nothing other than beautifying yourself as a human being, becoming a human being that emanates beauty, jamal. I tell you what, through you, people will be guided just by the power of your aura. We don't realize that there is an aura that accompanies us in the same way that there are supernal beings. The Quran describes them as mu'aqqabat, and the Quran describes them as qareen. We're not going to get into that because that's a lot of speculative theology. But what also accompanies us, and there's actually now remarkably scientific instruments that start measuring this stuff. There's even a shop here in LA, it's called the Aura Shop, where you can go and they try to take pictures of your aura. I mean, we all carry an aura. If we're angry people, people react to us through that. If we're anxious people react to that anxiety. If we are loving and beautiful people, people react to that as well. And I can't tell you how many people came to Allah simply by the virtue of being in the presence of that beauty. Nothing else. Not a word uttered. Do that, and you'll see. That is assuming that you have nothing, nothing else that Allah has given you other than the ability to just beautify yourself. And to beautify yourself, you have to be brutally honest about every way that you denied others their rights, every way that you transgressed upon others. When I see someone trying to pretend to be beautiful, and they have, they're unfair to their children, they're unfair to their wife or to their husband, they're unfair to their aunts and mothers and uncles, they're unfair to this and unfair to that. That's nonsense. You cannot be a beautiful human being if you exist in injustice, because that is against the sunnah, against the nature, the laws of nature that Allah has created.
Sorry, another question. Unless you want to go ahead.
No, go ahead. Is it a follow-up question?
No, it's a little bit different question, but oftentimes we hear of usulis who come out and criminalize the world and do injustice in the world in terms of violence or crimes, yet they ascribe themselves as usulis. Can you comment on that and the name of this organization as such?
No, they don't. They don't describe themselves as Usulis. They always describe themselves as Salafis. There's a difference, because although the West uses the term fundamentalisms or fundamentals, and that is in reference to a Protestant historical period, and it's sort of projected upon Islam. The Salafi methodology is a methodology of imitation of the past, which is something that, of course, all of us as Muslims are in one extent or another Salafis. You can't be a Muslim if you're not, because one extent or another, we reference the moral example of the Prophet ﷺ. We reference the moral example of Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet. We reference the moral example of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. And when you do so, you're referring to the Salaf al-Salih. So in one extent or another, you're Salafis. Now, but the idea of Usuliyya is different. And it's not a comprehensive school, it's not a comprehensive methodology. I mean, it's more of a paradigm. And that is to say, the point is not to imitate blindly. The point is to deduce principles. You want to call them organizing principles, moral principles, normative principles, ethical principles that have guided the prophets and their companions. And these principles, these ethical principles or moral principles, must be studied and applied systematically. So I give the example, for instance, when you derive from so many of what the Prophet ﷺ said and taught, the principle bara al-asliya, that there is a presumption of innocence, that everyone is presumed innocent unless proved otherwise. Now, where do we know that? Well, we know that from numerous Quranic discourses about if you accuse someone, you have to bring the bayyina, you have to bring the evidence, that you cannot simply accuse someone without evidence. That we know it from numerous precedents where they reported about the Prophet ﷺ, where people are charged of this or charged of that, and there's always a call of evidence, and unless there is an evidence, and even the process of qasam in the Quran, taking an oath, and so if you don't have evidence, then the accuser takes an oath, but that oath is rebutted by the oath of the accuser, and a study of a great deal of material is distilled in an ethical rule. The ethical rule is everyone is presumed innocent until proven otherwise. Now we have other principles like ad-darurat tubihu al-mahzurat. The necessities will allow the forbidden. The idea of al-usuliyya is not blind imitation. It's actually, the idea is the application of rational processes in order to deduce moral principles from the entire normative tradition of Islam. The closest, and I don't see anything in the modern age that comes close to what I'm calling usuliyya, right? The closest we come is the books of Qarafi, on the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya, or Al-Ashbah al-Nazair by Ibn Nujaym, or Suyuti, or the works on Usul al-Fiqh. So if a Muslim comes and says, but wait a minute, there are many usulis, meaning experts in Usul al-Fiqh and in Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya in Islamic history. In fact, Sheikh Taha Jabr al-Alwani, rahmahullah, may Allah bless his soul, used to describe himself as an usuli, and he was, because his entire project was studying the normative principles that guide the morality of a Muslim. We don't claim, no proper usuli would claim a monopoly over the truth. So if someone comes to me and says, you've missed a principle, quite possible, let's talk about it. Usuli comes and says, your study of the tradition doesn't lead to this principle, it leads to some different principle. I believe in my investigation, but as an Imam Shafi'i once said, but I always have the possibility, open the possibility that I'm wrong. What you want to engage me, I am committed as an usuli to the idea that you engage me through rational evidence, dalail. We don't engage through whimsical discourse, and we don't engage through impulsive reactions. Do I expect every Muslim to be an usuli? My belief is every Muslim who accepts the idea of a sirat al-mustaqim and who accepts the idea of an anchor and a center must accept the idea of living by morality, by ethics. Because if you're looking for a text to guide, to tell you what you should do, how you should act on every precedent, I believe you've betrayed the spirit of the Islamic message. That's not an usuli. You might call yourself a Salafi, I just call you misguided. Because when I see a Muslim today wanting to know, I was just in a lecture at UCLA, and some guy, made a comment, sort of the typical Orientalist smug comments about how the Muslims look to the Sunnah of the Prophet as to how to go to the bathroom and brush their teeth, and what do I say? It's if you study the adab, the precedents, in order, for instance, to deduct the principle of hygiene, then I'm with you. But if you study this precedent in order to reach the conclusion that I must use the miswak and nothing but the miswak, then I say you've betrayed the tradition. Because I'm sure if the Prophet ﷺ was here today, the Prophet ﷺ would use whatever is more conducive to the principle of hygiene. That's the legacy of Usuliyya in Islamic history. It's a systematic inquiry into normative principles of Islam.
I have a good question as a follow-up. This
Yeah.
came in over the email on our website. Assalamu alaikum. My question is regarding keeping a beard. Is it mandatory? I often hear that all four schools of thought have agreed that keeping a beard is an obligation for a Muslim man. Is this true? It would be great if the Professor can address this question at the next one.
This is it is always included, and by the way, it is never included in books of jurisprudence. It is always included in books on etiquette, adab. Now, these books had a very particular role in Islamic history. These books on adab were written within an intellectual context in which you didn't expect the public, the amma, the laity, to understand deep theological issues because most of the laity was illiterate, couldn't read and write anyway. And there was an epistemological framework where the elite would be expected to understand nuanced ideas, complex ideas, but the laity would be given a distilled version of religiosity, where it would be quite simple so they can identify as Muslim. And the laity, by the way, in the medieval age, where if they existed in our age, they would shock the heck out of us because their practices were often would be shocking to the modern sensibilities. Put it this way, everything from the way they would the way they would consume food, the way they would go to the bathroom, the way they would build tribal affiliations and enter into feuds and so on and so forth. So the role of works on raqa'iq and adab was to give the laity a sense of identity and a sense of being anchored in an Islamicity. So in these books, not the books of ahkam, not the books of fiqh, in these books, the books of adab and raqa'iq, they would often tell the laity that men would grow beards. And there was a cultural context to it, and the cultural context was that if you didn't have a beard, that would often identify you either as a homosexual or as within certain Christian groups. Not the Jews would grow their beards, Muslims would grow their beards. Now, in terms of do these reports, do these traditions rise to the level of a legal obligation? My answer is no. They don't rise to the level of a legal obligation. Did these reports exist playing a particular social function in history? Yes. Do I believe that the Prophet ﷺ instructed or that Allah ordained that Muslim men grow their beards? I don't believe so. Why don't I shave? Because I like having a beard. I have to admit, I just think it's what my teachers did. So I just do what they do because I don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about this issue. Maybe if I did, I would shave. But because I don't, I just imitate my teachers because I love my teachers. That's it. But I don't believe it's an obligation, and I don't even believe it's a sunnah. Those who believe differently, grow your beards. All the power to you. Considering everything that's going on in the Muslim world, I'm not going to make it an issue.
Question.
Okay, let's go to Sana.
Yes. Most certainly, the Sahaba at the time of the Prophet ﷺ had the Prophet himself as a teacher, and they became one of the best human beings ever to live. Now, in our day and time, over here, especially in the US, for us Arabs who migrated, we kind of have a somewhat fair background about Islam. But our children don't. And we lack that teacher. And teacher is not once a month. It's not once every Sira conference or a conference, Maya conference or whatever. You hear a lecture here and a lecture there. And it's not going to college and university and joining a group, a certain group that may direct you in opposite directions. What is the solution here for our generations? Because I see vividly how a lot of them have lost identity and lost directions, and any word can change them. They don't have that solid ground to stand on. And that affects us as well, because we are here in dilemma. What would be the solution in that case?
Far from being the fastest growing religion in the West, I completely share your anxiety because the attrition rate among Muslims, young Muslims, is horrifying. And this is the part what was intended by the Islamophobes. I mean, again, the Islamophobes quite consciously were directing a discourse that would create an enormous amount of anxiety about being Muslim in our children, and an enormous amount of discomfort. And it has affected everyone. It has affected everyone. I mean, in fact, I rarely find a Muslim now who doesn't, in some level or another, have some of the Islamophobic questions in their mind. Some level of embarrassment, some level of discomfort, some level of so on. But we cannot continue responding to this individually. What did the Islamophobes do? The Islamophobes collected each other, found each other, invested resources, built institutions, and launched a campaign. We continue to ask the question, deal with the expression that used to be said, I think in the 80s or 90s, it takes a village to raise a child. Who was it that said it?
Clinton.
It is quite true. It takes a collectivity, a community. We continue responding to the issue as if it is not a public public policy issue. a matter that needs a coordinated, cohesive response. So, what is the solution? The solution is that we, one, wake up and realize that this is a coordinated attack to, in 2 or 3 generations, to make Islam completely vanish by having all the, and that the response must be in looking for our talented resources, our, our smartest people, not. I said once, I'll give you. Actually, Sharif reminded me of this example that I once said. I'm a horrible video game player. When I play video games, I'm really bad. I die in 2 seconds, right? I have a way of convincing myself that I'm a brilliant video game player. 1, I don't play with anyone online. 2, I play on the easiest level. And 3, I have very low expectations of myself. And so then I feel really good because I always think I'm doing brilliantly. This is the way we've dealt with Muslim institutions, right? Muslims, instead of engaging the mainstream and competing at the mainstream, instead of demanding from our children, demanding that we get the brightest and the most intelligent and the most gifted and support them, we've created our little ghetto institutions that are completely marginal to anything, and we supported these. So I share your anxiety as a parent, because it's something that I struggle with all the time. But also, as now, I realize that there will not be a solution until we divert our investments and our resources and concentrate them on the jihad of the day. And the jihad of the day is intellectual. It's not weapons, it's not killing, it's persuading, convincing. And when we wake up to that fact, I think the whole reality of where Muslims are in the modern world will change. Because and here is where my conviction as a believer is. I truly believe that Allah then will, then Allah will say, okay, I owe you my aid.
Abrafi?
Assalamu alaikum. My question is about Sunni and Shia, and I'm blessed with being pretty ignorant about it. So all I have to do is be a Muslim. It works for me. But I've just recently become aware that the Shia pray 3 times a day. And I want to know how this came about, the difference between 5 times a day and 3 times a day, and also how it is that it is okay to combine prayers and how that's done. I've heard so many different ways that it's just confusing.
Yeah, I mean the issue of Sunnah Shia, it's one of the worst fitnas, one of the worst ways that a wedge has been driven to, especially and driven unfortunately by Muslims much more than Islamophobes or anything like that. And by power politics. I mean there are a lot of people who have an interest in making sure that Muslims keep being distracted in these side little schisms and the theology between Shia and Sunnah is deeply embedded in history and unfortunately has a long legacy that, and with a lot of prejudice and a lot of stereotypes on both sides and a lot of misunderstandings on both sides. And it's good to be blissfully ignorant of it, and it's good and one of the things that in the 80s I was encouraged by is that you would find young American Muslims growing up not really caring about whether they're Sunnah or Shia and just saying exactly as you said, I'm just a Muslim. Unfortunately, this issue, this fitna, has chased us, and now especially after the war on terror and the role of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and their power politics with Iran, and so they exported this power politics to Muslims in the West, unfortunately quite intentionally. But the issue of prayer, the Shia pray 5 prayers, but they combine Dhuhr and Asr and combine Maghrib and Isha. And as a fiqhi matter, the evidence for it is there. I mean, it's not what I follow, or it's not what I believe, but I can, and the way they find evidence for it is that they believe that the obligation to pray Asr is triggered once the adhan once you complete Dhuhr. And so there are 2 distinct prayers, but you can pray Asr and Dhuhr as late as Asr continues, but you follow Asr immediately you follow Dhuhr immediately with Asr, and same with Maghrib and Isha. Now, I don't want to get into the juristic debates about it, because we get into the matter of transmissions of reports, and which reports came through the family of the Prophet, and which reports came through companions of the Prophet, and the issues they take with reports that come through the companions, and why other jurists preferred the reports that came through the companions rather than the family of the Prophet. But the issue of combining prayer, especially for Muslims in the West, is something that is worth really talking about, because for cause, you can combine prayer, especially if you need to do so that you don't miss Asr prayer while at work. And this is an issue that we can talk about in some detail if people want to, but combine prayer for cause. If, for instance, you know that you're in the evening, there's a chance, or I'm sorry, not in the evening, but there's a chance that you will miss Asr prayer if you don't pray it with Dhuhr, then pray it with Dhuhr. Or if you will come back home very late and you're worried that you're going to fall asleep without praying Isha, then pray Isha with Maghrib. There's enough license in Islamic law to allow for that, and without it being something that is whimsical or just without support.
Does that include shortening the prayer itself? In other words, 2
No.
rak'ah for Dhuhr and 2 rak'ah for
No,
Asr?
because the only time that is allowed is when you are in travel, and there's a whole discussion about what type of travel would allow that. But combine, yes, but don't shorten, as long as you're in your homestead.
And also the professor actually is going to be giving a talk at the Islamic Center, Southern California, on the Sunni-Shi'i divide, February 25th, I believe. It's that Sunday at noon. So, but I'll send out an email.
Yeah, I'll talk there about the history and the theology in more detail, as an educational matter.
Any questions? Or I have some. Go ahead.
Just ask, is it true to say that demons and shaitan has no power unless me or the person kind of empowered by my actions? Or how does that?
Allah tells us directly in the Quran that the shayateen, especially the shayateen al-jinn, including Satan, have no sultan, they have no power over the believers and those who are in the shadow of God and in the light of God. I can that theology, and it is true. I mean, Allah also told us that if you feel that you have been touched by the demonic, أصابك نزغ من الشيطان, then seek refuge in Allah, and you must believe that Allah is of your full protection. My experience in life, and I've come to, I started first with, like a lot of people who grow up reading philosophy and very skeptical about any of this tale, but I've experienced enough in life to see a complete confirmation of the fact that the demonic gains power over human beings when they compromise themselves. And they either invite the demonic into their lives explicitly or by diluting their rational ability to resist. So through alcohol, through drugs, through addiction to certain promiscuous behavior. But they always, if they seek refuge in Allah, I cannot, and this is, by the way, a remarkable, I've known, I've come to befriend a lot of Muslim exorcists, and I've never seen a Muslim go through the type of possessions that you encounter in the West, in the Christian context. I believe that, and this is something I don't say lightly, and it will sound very strange from an academic and a scholar and so on, but I'm willing to defend it in any context people want to invite me to. The Trinity seems to open a door for demonic possessions that are very brutal. That never occurs in the Muslim context. I've never seen a person possessed in the Muslim context in the way that you see in the Christian context. And unfortunately, out of God's mercy, God comes to the aid of everyone, even those who invoke God within the context of the Trinity. But the Trinity allows some serious damage to the human spirit. May God forgive me if I'm wrong.
Any questions, Sophia?
Yeah, so I have a question, but I'm trying to figure out how to best phrase it. I think what I'm getting is that the purpose behind the Usuli Institute is to get people to open their minds to really understand and compete, if you will. You said on an intellectual level, but everybody has their own areas that they focus on, not just religious studies, legal studies or Islamic Sharia. And it seems to be that when people do rise to the level of competing intellectually in their field, say like, engineers, lawyers, politicians, whatever it is, they're not competing academically or intellectually, on a religious level. They lose the forest for the trees. And I don't know if it's because we don't have the resources maybe to be able to do both, or it seems very difficult, other than the people that focus or work in the same field of Islam and like our sheikhs or whatever, but the rest of us that are, you know, you kind of do, our work isn't necessarily in the Islamic field, if you will, but we do want to be able to see things in that way. I feel like once you kind of rise to compete to that level, you see most people lose that like faith element, either go off track or focus.
No, you're right, but even in the, I mean, one of the realities of our one of the realities is that all Muslims who enter into, let's say, Islamic studies and compete and rise to the top of the field in Islamic studies, will the vast majority of them disengage from a commitment to their tradition, and in fact, Islamic studies is still very much captive to what I call, what Edward Said called Orientalist enterprise, what I call a colonial enterprise. It's where your role as a expert in Islamic studies is to deconstruct that tradition and to despirit it. But when you have a sociological reality like this, you have two options. You either say, well, that's the way it is, and I'm out, and you go off in the wilderness, you know, whatever, or you decide to lead the fight and say this cannot continue. So the purpose of the Usuli Institute, I do admit, I mean, first and foremost, it's an Islamic discourse enterprise. The greatest focus is to get those people who are in the areas related to Islamic studies to not become alienated from their tradition and not to become part of either the Orientalist enterprise or the colonial enterprise, and to encourage committed discourses from within the field that are empowered by this tradition rather than defeated by it. So that's one. But second, if the Usuli Institute had the resources, and we talked about this, I think, in the first couple of halaqas, or first halaqa in particular, would be thrilling to sponsor, champion, celebrate maybe achievements in all areas in which Muslims can make a contribution inspired by Islamic normativities. And so, I mean, the example I can draw on is whether ultimately people agreed with it or not, many of the composers of Baroque music believed that they're writing music in service of God, and that they're making these brilliant, like Bach, for instance, who was deeply religious and believed that he was articulating the will of God through his music. I have to admit that when I listen to a lot of Bach, I do feel God. You know, so I connect with it. Doesn't mean that everyone else will, but that was Bach's mission. If the Usuli Institute had the types of resources that I don't know if others in the Usuli Institute dream of it, but that I dream of, that we would sponsor and would be a vehicle for encouraging, brilliant Islamic articulations or brilliant articulations by Muslims that are inspired by the Islamic tradition in various fields, including art and music and architecture and I don't know what else. I had a colleague at UCLA who passed away, who was in the field of public health. And he was very active in Islamic studies at UCLA for many, many years. And I used to find this very interesting because in public health, why are you active in Islamic studies? And I never forgot his comment. His name was Osman Galam, rahmahullah. His comment to me that he cannot separate the call of public health from what he sees as the call of Islam. Now that is like an ethic that would be wonderful for the Usuli Institute to celebrate. I mean, if you had the resources and you had a gifted Muslim in the field of public health, and he comes to the Usuli Institute and says, help me organize a conference that leads to a book about Islam and the role of public health. Why not? That would be brilliant. That would be wonderful. It's that breadth of vision that I dream of. The Muslims get out of their little parochial caves and their tendency to go into these little invisible ghettos and disappear in them from public life. That's not becoming of the great message of Islam. If you truly believe that Islam is a light upon humanity, which I believe, you become empowered by that, and you treat it with the dignity that it deserves.
Fadl has a question.
Yes, sir.
I have a question. It's more like a very basic stuff.
Grab the mic. Go ahead.
So my question is that, in self-help books genre, there's always this concept about finding your passion, or finding your purpose in life. What is the meaning of life, and then follow your passion. And to connect that to like some basic stuff such as like in music, for example, like how do I know if music is for me, or how do I know if I'm painting is actually for me? How do I see the God in it, as if something is being blessed? Basically, how do I know if what I'm doing is actually something that's gonna be good? For example, like music, for example, if I like to become a composing music, electronic music, or classical music, how do I know if it's actually okay when, if I read about stuff, like people would even say like music is haram in Islam. It's already like, that's actually a no-no. On the other hand, there's like this tendency in the US that typically go for, lawyer, engineering, or being a doctor, like those kind of stuff. Like, how do I know if I just go off
I mean, one of we either raise people as ahrar, as free people, or we either raise people with the mentality of a free human being, or we raise people with the mentality of in the Islamic terms, it's called abid, which I know the word slave is very loaded in English, but the mentality of slaves. And it is quite, when we raise our children charting the path for them, they never learn to think for themselves, and they never learn to have an autonomous, independent energy about them that is ready to creatively engage the world. And if you raise kids with the expectation that you'll do the thinking for them, they always become dependent human beings. Now, the reason I say this is that, unfortunately, we raise our children with laws and rules, but we don't, and this is because they learn through example, right? If you don't have a relationship with Allah where you figure out who you are as a human being in partnership, in the company of Allah's guidance, your children cannot learn it because they haven't seen it. I mean, they learn it by example. If they see you pray on everything, and you are constantly saying, I am thinking of doing this so I'm going to pray on it. And say, I've prayed on it, and I'm still not, I don't have peace about it. I'm going to pray on it again. Oh, why are you reading the Quran? Oh, I'm reading the Quran because I have this big decision, and so I am praying and doing dua, and I'm trying to, because I want Allah to answer me. If this is your conduct, your children will grow up doing the same. But that also to respond to the question of how you know. Yeah, self-help books, although I'm not a big believer in them, I have to admit, but they're essentially right in that you must learn to answer the call of yourself. But there's a further step. You must learn to differentiate within the self the call of your base self, your lower self, the self that basically says do what is fun and what brings you pleasure but has no higher purpose, and the call that comes from Allah, the higher self, and that says do what is right by you but also right by others, the call of justice. So it is not just a matter of what brings me satisfaction, but what is fair and just to all. Now, keep in mind that we, and when I say we, the people who have been colonized, who come from underdeveloped countries, colonized countries, we have been raised in despotism and subjugation. So we have for a long time, as immigrants, we don't have the art, the ability to listen to the call of ourselves, because we are raised within a very segmented hierarchical structure of do what you're told and don't ask questions. That doesn't mean it's too late for us. It means that we just have to work very hard to rediscover ourselves, and within the limits of trying to rediscover ourselves without being unjust to others. So, does this mean, and this is sad quite often. So, for instance, my call was to be a poet. Now, I can't be a poet now without being unjust to other people. So, do I accept the fact that perhaps I cannot be a poet, that part of me is gone? Yeah, I accept it. But I don't lose the poetry. It's a part of me in a critical ways forever. Now, maybe if I was raised in a free society, in a society where that was not dominated by the impulse of despotism, maybe it would have been different. But that's beside the point, because I believe that Allah guides me. Because I do nothing, I take no step without constantly going back to Allah in prayer and dua. And that's what, and by the way, that's what I often miss in Muslim communities, both among so-called quote-unquote reformers, who often are high on ideas and intellectual talk, but low on the spirituality. And those who are, let's say, more traditional, who are high on the performance of piety, but not spirituality, the impulse of the investigation and the intoxications and the thrills of the spirit. It's like riding a bicycle or driving a car. You can talk about it theoretically forever, but until you actually try it and you do it, you don't actually realize it. It doesn't become a part of your consciousness. So I always tell people, just try talking to God. Try praying on every decision. Commit in one day that the 5 prayers is just going to be the minimum you do. but that every time you get an idea about, do I want to do this or not do this, you're going to go and pray and ask God. Try it and then come talk to me. Now, a lot of people, it's a deal breaker because they're too lazy. You know, God's saying we do the 5 prayers. You want us to now run every time we get an idea and pray more? You haven't tasted the joy in prayer. You're still within the tradition of just performance, not meaning. And in another time, we'll talk about the meaning of prayer, because once you understand the meaning of prayer, and I don't mean the theoretical meaning, I'm actually, why do we do rak'ahs? Why do we do sujuds? Why do we read the Fatiha? It is, it's transformative. I mean, one of the remarkable things in my travels, I go and I ask Muslims, in so many different contexts, do you know why do we do rak'ah and why do we do sujood? And today I've never encountered in the US someone who said, yes, I know, I've read this and that, and I've read the discourses on it. That's very sad. That's very, very sad. So inshallah we'll do.
So it's Maghrib now. We could break for Maghrib, and if you have energy, we can continue after, or we
I know
can
that there were some questions that let's pray Maghrib, and then I know that there were some questions that I read that now I'm not remembering, so I feel guilty.
Do you want me?
If you,
I can read
as when we break for Maghrib, if you could just go over them. I mean, we don't have to answer all of them, but at least if there are some that, I'm just need to remind them. Is anyone still awake in the
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think they've all gone to bed.
Okay. Sweet dreams.
Yes, we're done. Okay, so let's take a break and.
Before we take any more questions, I want to say a couple of things. They're not necessarily related, but it's. I know that especially the folks in Europe and are perhaps even more engaged with this issue than we are. When I talk about the colonial legacy and the reality of immigrants, the culture of immigrants that come to the U.S. and so on, keep in mind that there is no solution possible without first awareness. I mean, a big step is to become first aware of the seriousness of the efforts to co-opt Islamic, the potential and the trajectory of Islamic normativities. And only if you are fully aware of the seriousness of this effort will you become motivated to counter them. It's one of the realities is that in the context of the war on terror, it crept up on Muslims while Muslims were in a state of oblivion, largely because the ugliness of organizations like Al-Qaeda and so on stunned Muslims into being in a sort of in a frozen state, in a state where they're concerned just with apologizing for being Muslim, and in that state of intellectual immobility, Islamophobia became a remarkable, overwhelming reality. Be fully aware of the fact that even the slaughter of the Rohingyas that is going on now, to the repression of the Chechens in Russia, to the way that the Kashmiris are treated in India, to the way that the world is ignoring the plight of Muslims in China, it's all tied into the trajectory of Islamophobia. Because if you just try in any international context to raise the issue of the way Muslims are treated in China, the reaction to you is, oh, are you defending an Islamist project? Well, that is what Islamophobia did. That it constantly puts you on the defensive, that the minute you demand your rights as a human being, you're suspected of an Islamist project, whatever that means. No one is sure what that means. Whenever you demand that that Muslims have the right of autonomy and the right of self-determination, you're immediately accused of an Islamist project. Now, there is no way to counter that without the investment of resources, people. I mean, and I'm saying this for the recording, for whoever, out there hears this. If you think that somehow the truth can be spoken on the net or in a book and it will break the curse of Islamophobia, you're deluded. Communication in the modern world is very much an art, a very complex art. And it has people who specialize in it. And what is ironic is we know that, Saudi Arabia paid Sisi's government to pay an American PR firm. It was something like $1 billion. You guys read that story? It's the same PR firm that the Saudi royal family uses to improve the image of the Saudi royal family. And it's also the same PR firm. I forgot its name, but you can look it up. It's easily, you can find it. And we're talking about, Sisi's government asked the Saudis to pay the $1 billion fee for them so that negative publicity can be countered. People invest billions of dollars in communicating who they are. And I can think of a million different examples. I mean, imagine if what is happening to the Rohingyas. We're talking about rapes, we're talking about murder of children, infants, we're talking about mass burials. No one in the world cares. Imagine if this was happening to a Christian or a Jewish group. Imagine if what's happening to the Chinese Muslims, the Hueys, was happening to, and in fact Christians, every time they've tried to persecute the Chinese government, every time they've persecuted Christian evangelist groups, they were called to answer by Western governments and by the White House. And I can tell you, in the asylum field, we always have plenty of support when we have a Chinese applying for asylum on the basis of being persecuted as a Christian in China. We have plenty of documentation from the State Department. When it's a Muslim applying for asylum from China, we have zero documentation by the State Department. And the State Department has documentation because of NGOs, non-governmental agencies, that pressure the State Department to provide these documentation. So, being aware is the first step. Okay, so now that I've depressed you, I want to share with you something completely different. Okay. And it has to do with imaan, because I believe that all the political talk, all the fancy analysis, all the fancy philosophy, all the sophisticated discourses that intellectuals are capable of is based on nothing unless it's based on the sweetness of imaan. And I'll tell you, if you want to know what iman does for you, what faith does for you, and Muslim faith, especially Muslim faith in my experience, it gives you, you know, people have compared it to a state of fragrance. It's as if it's a tib, as they call it, a state of constant fragrance. You feel a repose and a tranquility, a sweetness that you cannot describe and you cannot communicate, but it becomes an intoxicant in and of itself. You know, when I read material about alcoholics and drug addicts, and the odd thing is that I can relate to it. I can relate to it by my addiction to the sweetness. I miss it the minute I walk away from it, and I crave it constantly. And the minute I interact with people, and I have to struggle with myself. It's like the addict who has to struggle not to go hide in a closet and get a drink, you know, to calm their nerves. Well, I struggle with myself not to escape from the public to go be with Allah, because it's such an liberating. And it anchors you in strength. You no longer care who thinks about you what and who says about you what. So, you know that you could say things that would make you more popular. And you could not say things that would make you more popular. But nothing matters to you. If you want it, seek it. Because as the Hadith al-Qudsi reported from the Prophet ﷺ says, that Allah is as you think of Allah. If you expect the best from Allah, you will receive the best. If you expect an angry and vindictive and vengeful God, that's the God you're going to live with. It's very much, you know, when I often tell students, and I don't remember if the students present here, if I told them this or not, you want to be scholars, act and think like scholars. Embody the image of a scholar. Don't you know, see yourself as living with books late into the night, eschewing any pleasures and turning away from, and just saying, I visualize yourself as a scholar. Allah is like your dhan in Allah. Your dhan, your expectation in Allah. And it is absolutely true. You take one step and you find that Allah takes 10. It is absolutely true. You just take a minimal effort and you find the reciprocation is remarkable. Now, one of the signs of iman is articulated for us in the Quran. يَدْرَؤُونَ بِالْحَسَنَةِ السَّيِّئَةِ. One of, when iman enters your heart, when you become in a state of companionship with Allah, and I'm just teaching you what my shuyukh taught me. Your state of being becomes repelling any ugliness with goodness. Replacing any ugliness you confront with goodness. So you see people that are jealous, you help them. You see people that are angry, you love them. You see people that want to hurt you, you say, I want nothing but the best for you. That is the state of iman. Those that don't haven't tasted the sweetness of iman are in a state of turbulence and restlessness, and they do not begin to understand what does it mean to repel, as the Quran says, to repel ugliness with beauty. السيئة بالحسنة. السيئة بالحسنة. How many times does the Quran repeat that? And how often do we as Muslims reflect on that? In our past, we have great sages that wrote volumes on that, right? I mean, if you just Google books translated from Arabic to English about love in the Islamic tradition, about beauty in the Islamic tradition, you'll find a lot of English sources translated from Arabic. Imam Asim actually wrote a dissertation about Rumi, which talks about that. It's not published. Inshallah it will be. It's the nectar of faith. It's the perfume of faith. That is its nature. Okay, I've said what I had to say. I said what I went and did my little consultation and that's what I was told to say. So I said it. Who knows? Maybe somewhere in Timbuktu needs to hear this 10 years from now. But that's not my business. That's Allah's business. I don't ask Allah why. I just do.
Any questions? Okay, why don't I read a couple that we have? So what?
I'll just answer ones that would be short. So I'll defer the long ones. Well, ask anyway, but I'll just...
Okay, you know what? I'm going to read it, and you decide what you want to answer. Okay. Number one, what does the Quran say, if anything, about the New Testament we have today? I understand that the Quran says the Torah and the Injil were given to Jesus. Does the Quran understand the Injil to be the same as the New Testament and or the four canonical Gospels? And 1a, if the Bible is warped or changed, what parts and where? And then the next question is, can Professor Khalid explain the concept of Prophet Muhammad's intercession on the Day of Judgment? The way it has been taught to me is that as long as you are part of the Ummah or community of Prophet Muhammad, you will enter paradise because the Prophet himself will plead on your behalf on the Day of Judgment. To me, this sounds like salvation. No matter what sins you have committed in life, as long as you believe in God and the Prophet, you are saved. In fact, at one gathering, the teacher referred to the Prophet Muhammad as literally our Savior. I feel uncomfortable with this concept as it is presented because I feel that it contradicts the justice of God. In other words, if a Muslim states the Shahada but lives a horrible life, he or she will still enter Jannah because he or she will be forgiven by God through the Prophet. Is not God the ultimate forgiver and filled with grace? Why do we need the Prophet to intercede, and why do people feel the need to pray through the Prophet in order for their prayer to be accepted? Weren't we taught as Muslims that Islam is beautiful because there is no middleman to God? Also, the Quran states clearly in several verses that there is no intercessor except by God's leave, which could mean the Prophet. But then again, the emphasis is on God's leave, as in God is ultimately the decider and can choose not to pardon.
These are really good questions. The first part I'm going to defer about the New Testament because that's a big issue and it would need a different session altogether. Yeah, it just, yeah, there's no way I can even come close to it and not. But the second one about the shafa'a or the intercession, there is like the concept of, like the emergence of the concept of the intercession of Jesus in order to absolve humans of their sins. This theme, the theme of salvation through the intervention of something superhuman. And it's fascinating because in paganism, it was the intervention or the intercession through sacrifice. So it is the subhuman that you sacrifice. And it's in its more extreme forms, even the sacrifice of war captives and things like that, which are rendered subhuman. And then you attain the pleasure of the salvation of the deity through the presentation of a sacrifice. Now, when paganism, in the anti-paganist normativities that accompanied especially and this is before the message of Jesus, the emergence of various forms of monotheistic discourses during the Second Temple, the second Temple of Israel. The idea and the theme was that no, it's not the intercession of a subhuman, but the intercession of a superhuman that is needed for salvation. In other words, you need the self-sacrificial act of something higher, not something lower. This part of the discourse is fascinating, and it played a huge role in the birth of Christianity, and which emerged initially as a cult within Judaism, but then it for various reasons, it correlated really well with ancient Egyptian mythology and the influence of ancient Egyptian mythology upon the Greco-Roman mind and so on. Similarly, in Islam, it's quite remarkable that the human mind seems to have a self-deprecating portion where it cannot imagine that it would be saved per its own actions. And I think there's a great deal of human insecurity about just relying on your own actions and your own behavior. It's as many of us want to believe that, well, even if I am a lousy human being, it's okay because something will step in to save me. And I can sit and point to when and where these corruptions entered into Islamic theology. The idea that the prophet becomes like a Jesus-like figure interceding to save us despite our own accountability. But it's exactly that. It's a corruption. I do believe that the prophet will appeal on behalf of those who deserve appeal in the final day. And I believe, and this is the realm of Allah, we only speculate about it, but there is evidence that not just the Prophet Muhammad, but the various prophets will basically appeal to God's mercy to forgive those who deserve forgiveness. But there is a huge difference between appeal and simply intercession on behalf, even those who have not held themselves morally accountable in their lives. That's a corruption like the corruption of the idea of Jesus dying as a salvation for our sins. That's the short version. The long version is where I actually go into when and where these reports came in and how, but I won't right now because it will take us a very long time. But I will say this. There were mass converts from Christianity and Judaism into Islam. And in the first 2 centuries. And many of these converts brought Jewish theology, Jewish mythology, and Christian mythology into Islam. and circulated them in the form of hadith. Sayyid is sort of an expert on that because he writes a dissertation about a certain part of that process. I'm advertising for his dissertation because I just read it and it's really good. So that's the short version of it. That it is a not denying the idea of appeal by the Prophet ﷺ. The reason we pray on the Prophet is nothing to do with that, with the intercession. When we, and I gave a khutbah about this, we enter into a relationship in which we acknowledge indebtedness to those who deserve. The earmark of an inequitable personality is that it owes no gratitude. You want to know the problem with sort of the modern psyche is the lack of gratitude. We grow up, we don't acknowledge gratitude to anyone that deserves gratitude. Not to teachers, not to parents, not to friends, not to neighbors. We act as if this electricity works by just, no, you owe a debt of gratitude for the people who work hard to make this electricity possible. A debt of gratitude for the people who created this chair. A debt of gratitude, leave alone greater gratitude for that who created the whole body and parents and friends and family and so on. If you're anchored in gratitude, you're anchored in morality. The nature of kufr is that you don't recognize gratitude. It's not part of your psyche. That's why one of the first lessons you learn vis-a-vis your shuyukh, and I never understood this when I was learning it, I understood it much later, is to teach you to be grateful towards your teachers. Because they're teaching you the nature of the dynamics of iman. So that is why we constantly pray upon the Prophet and all the prophets, because of our gratitude to them. Because we're entering in this humbling dynamic in which humility becomes the basis for the central aspect of our character and the central aspect for our morality. Humble people tend to transgress upon the rights of others far less than people who have no humility. Think about that. How often have you met people who are humble and transgressors at the same time? Not often. We live in modernity in cultures that have forgotten the virtues of humility and gratitude. And we must reinvestigate our faith by re-establishing these virtues. Okay. Or,
I have one just from someone who had to leave,
okay.
a convert. So she was asking, she said, when you enter into the community as a convert, all you continue to hear is rules and rules and rules and rules. Everywhere you go, whether it's a class, whether it's this. And so they were trying to create, among a small convert group, bringing in people who could talk more to address spirituality. And then they had to go and, find someone who was a Naqshbandi Sufi and come talk to them about beauty and love. But then they started hearing about how Sufis are haram and, kafirs and all this sort of stuff. So how do you find the spirituality that can help you in this environment? How do you, because it's such a lonely road that if, you kind of have to find that spirituality on your own, and especially if you're starting out new, it's hard to do.
I mean, the sad realities is that, before the colonial era, the predominant version of Islam all around the Muslim world was Sufism. That's just a fact, a historical fact. I've dedicated so much of my life to demonstrate that nationalism which took out the non-Arab elements because of the Arab rebellions, and took out the Turks, took out the Malays, took them out of the equation of Islamicity, and by doing that, it also took out a lot of the wind out of Sufism, because Islam spread in Indonesia and Malaysia and Philippines and through Sufism, so through Sufi organizations or Sufi movements. And Wahhabism became the dominant form of Islam in the Arab world, and then by extension the dominant form of immigrant Islam in the West. And that's the thing that converts encounter. Wahhabi Islam is very arid, is very austere. It doesn't talk about humility. It doesn't talk about gratitude. It doesn't talk about spiritual. It doesn't talk about, for Sufis, imagination is proof of the divine. If you want to see that there is a God, reflect upon imagination, because no machine can create it. But in Wahhabism, imagination is the door to the devil. Is the door of fitna. And that is why they say music is haram, twirling dervishes are haram, everything is a bid'ah. There was a guy after my last khutbah in the Islamic Center that came and said, this mosque, they read Quran before the khutbah. This is a bid'ah. He told them not to read Quran. And I said, what, do you want people to sit and gossip? He said, it's better than this bid'ah of reading Quran before the... even gossip would be better than... It's a very myopic, didactic form of Islam, this Wahhabi theology. Unfortunately, the reality is Wahhabi Islam is the dominant form of Islam among Muslim institutions in the West. That's in large part because of the retreat of the wealth of Saudi Arabia and the wealth of the Gulf countries and their ability to mobilize money, but also the retreat of very rich cultural elements in the Islamic tradition, like the Turks, like the Malays, like the Filipinos, from the mainstream picture. Because the nuance that they brought to the picture and the traditions of spirituality are remarkably rich and nuanced. Now, of course, having said all of that, for someone like our convert friend to say that's all very interesting, but what do we do, right? I think you must be like the first Muslims, like the khutbah I gave about declaring I am the first of Muslims. There are plenty, like for instance, Omid Safi wrote a book about the brother of Hamid al-Ghazali, Muhammad al-Ghazali, not the new, Ahmad al-Ghazali. Ahmad al-Ghazali, who wrote a very profound work on Sharia and love. If I was a convert Muslim, I would get all my fellow converts, you would get a book like that, and read it, study it, internalize it, and memorize it. Because that will teach you much more than any of the Wahhabi type imams that you encounter in Islamic centers. It will teach you the beauty and power of imaan and the power of Islam, and you will walk around with your head held high because you know the truth is in your heart, and no one can touch it. And there are other books like that. I mean, and I think part of what we should do is you should pin me down and force me to give you the names of books. Like, because we can have a list of 50 books. Like
we have some, but we're going to do it again.
Since with that last list, there are many others that came out. There's a book on love in the Quran that was written by a guy called Ghazi. Of course, no one paid him any attention, but it's a great book. it's a study of the tradition of the way that Quran talks about love.
Yeah,
Is it
logic
Arabic or-
application.
In English, it's in English. It's called Love in the Quran.
What about, I've heard certain people say that certain Sufi sheikhs elevate to a point where they can drink and smoke and get high, and then they actually do this.
You know, I've known a lot of Sufi shuyukh, and every Sufi sheikh that I've known has been more. The difference is that they don't display their piety in public for showmanship, but in my experience, they have been more pious than I could ever be. I mean, they give me a complex by the number of prayers they do every day, the number of days they fast, the number of dhikr they continue every day. Now, someone said, but you know, I am sure there's out there some Sufi sheikh, and I say, like who? They, well, I've read somewhere like Ibn Arabi, considered, also Ibn Arabi, the man insists that he was bound by every rule of Sharia, or maybe say it Hallaj, somewhat Hallaj. My response is, if you're Hallaj, then I and no one else is empowered to judge you. Then you know, you have such a relationship with Allah that all of humanity can't even understand. Because Hallaj was torn to pieces, dismembered, and didn't utter a single scream because he was so intoxicated by God's presence he didn't feel any pain. So that level is like superhuman. You can just stand there in awe and not say anything. So it's one of these false paradigms. You know, it's like someone tells me that, and I say, well, you know, I know a lot of. It's as if responding, say, well, a lot of Wahhabi shuyukh, they all have mut'am, siyar marriages and married children, and it's propaganda. It's not real life. Give me a Sufi sheikh that sits there and drinks and doesn't follow the rules and so on. I mean, it's just propaganda. Do you know anyone?
No.
I don't know anyone.
No, Rumi writes a lot about wine.
So do I. And I've never tasted wine in my life. I mean, it's the idea of intoxication. I've been intoxicated in God. And I imagine alcohol, and I just imagine it because I've never been intoxicated by alcohol. And I never tasted alcohol. But I imagine intoxication by alcohol would be something like that. So do I. So what? And I write a lot about love. It doesn't mean I'm promiscuous or that I've ever, you know, so what? And this is, by the way, takes us to when, you know, our pretentious intellectuals, when they have all this big deal about my friend, rahmahullah, Shab Ahmad's book, What is Islam, who says, oh, look, you know, the Muslims throughout history, when I say my friend, is because we were friends. He has passed away, but he wrote a book called What is Islam? And all these intellectuals are so excited about the book because he erroneously and unfortunately argues that Muslims have defined Islam in all these ways that are inconsistent with Sharia, and he concludes from that Sharia is irrelevant and unimportant. It's completely false. I mean, you can't rely on the imagination of poets in order to describe sociological reality. You write poetry yourself, you know that. Sharif wrote a poem about the dust of books becoming twirling dervishes. I don't think it means it actually happened, but, you know.
To me it did.
Yeah, to you.
Told you. I said this is not symbolic. Whatever.
Isn't it innovation part of believer's life? It's an integral part to a Muslim to be innovative. It's
Absolutely. I mean, and in fact, when anyone says bid'ah, remember that in theology there is an innovation, bid'ah sayyi'ah, bad innovation, and bid'ah hasana, a good innovation. And so when someone says innovation, it reflects an ignorance and it's as I said, it's the Najdi, the Najdis throughout Islamic history were known. If you the remarkable thing about history is that the Najdis, where Wahhabism emerged, were known. The tribes of Najd were known for their hard-headedness. They're like we call some of the Sa'ida in Egypt, people from South Egypt, hard-headed, black and white. They had a very even their poetry is all about cattle and camels and very little about love, very little about flowers, very little about water. It's so when the Najdis emerged with their brand of Islam, it was understandable that they would have that brand because they've had it for centuries. But what was not imaginable is that they would take over Hijaz, because Hijaz was always a cultural center of diversity. And that they would spread their influence into Kufa and Iraq, and that they would spread their influence into Yemen, and then they spread their influence into Egypt and onwards. That is an unprecedented in Islamic history. And then their influence would extend all the way to India, and it was truly revolutionary. And coupled with the retreat of the dominant intellectual power for several centuries, right before that happened, and that's the Ottoman Turks. You had the Ottoman Turks retreat suddenly, so the entire institutional framework became destabilized overnight, and it was a complete collapse.
Britain and Saudi Wahhabi forces.
Of course, they worked
really
in tandem, and that's why
ripped it off.
Yeah, and that's why the Islamophobes, when you point the finger and say colonialism worked hand in hand with Wahhabism to roll back all types of Islam except Bedouin Islam, Najdi Islam, the Islamophobes go nuts. They start attacking you. That's the reason I've been called stealth Islamist and all the conspiracy stuff. It's really because of that. Because they know that if Muslims become fully aware that Wahhabi Islam could have never become what it is if it hadn't been for colonialism, a whole revolution would take place. And so they freak out. And that's the part that they hate the most. And that's the part that also is the cause for the attempts on my life. There were 3 attempts. And I completely believe that it was because of that. Because of that little part, the intimate relationship between Bedouin, Najdi, Wahhabi Islam, and colonialism. To our very day.
I didn't know that, but I was
The last
unable-
attempt was what year?
I don't remember how many years ago.
The last attempt was trick.
That was 2006.
2000.
Thank you.
Right.
We are the expert here.
You're the expert in everything else in my life.
That's okay. She's the expert, I'm the spokesperson.
So be it. But that's neither here nor there. But it's really that's when you realize, okay, you've put your pulse on the truth. When you see people react that way, then you know, okay, that's the truth.
May Allah bless you.
You're all safe, by the way.
One last question. So I forgot. It was sent a
Good
while
last.
ago and I forgot. Can you talk about the dynamic of men and women shaking hands with one another?
Okay.
Hardest question of the night.
The issue, the illah in Sharia is fitna, right? That is sexual enticement. We have the only report that we have is when the Prophet received the bay'ah والسلام, from women, that he put his hand in water and they would put their hand in water. But, and this is a very big but, there is also a report, the same hadith report, that he actually shook hands. So it's a report that the Wahhabis, buried. It was a cause for a fight at Azhar when we had one of Shuyukh give his commentary on that shaking hand report, because the students of the Wahhabi students interrupted the Halaqa and wanted the Sheikh to shut up, and it just stuck in my memory. But then the other thing is the practice of putting your hands in water in receiving a covenant is well documented in Arabia, men and women. So even if it's true, it doesn't mean anything. So we go back, so where does it go back to? It goes back to the issue of fitna, the sexual enticement. If you are sexually aroused by a sheikh, then don't shake. I mean, I can tell you this. There are Shafi'is, and as I said, I am a Shafi'i, that have erroneously said that if you touch a woman, even if there is no sexual arousal, that negates your wudu. Erroneously, because they relied on evidence on a hadith that Aisha has rebutted, and a hadith from Abu Hurairah that Aisha has rebutted, and it's a split issue in the Shafi'i school, and the minority view is correct. The Malikis, the Hanafis have rejected it. The Hanbalis are obsessed with sex. The Hanbalis are just in every issue where women are concerned, they think sexual arousal is behind every corner. I don't, but that's the older Hanbali. I mean, sorry, that's the newer Hanbalis, because Ibn Qudama wasn't. I mean, Ibn Qudama was actually quite sophisticated on the issue of touching. He said that the illah is the fitna, and that's it, and left it at that. I'll tell you a story of, I saw my mother do with my mother was a mental health worker, and she was the head of a department, and as you know, she was the first woman to drive in Kuwait. Her license number, the first woman to ever drive in Kuwait. She taught my father how to drive, and back then Kuwaitis would actually stand and watch the marvel of a woman driving a car, and she drove a black Volks. So we were kids, and we're from a village in Egypt called Nikla al-Ainab, and in Nikla al-Ainab it's quite common when people shake hands, they would raise their garb like that, and the cover, and shake hands with the garb covered. So during and this is a cultural practice. It just doesn't mean anything. It actually means sort of respect. It doesn't mean that I'm aroused. It means I respect you. And so during the 80s, during the late 70s, when there sort of the influx of Wahhabism, so there got into a lot of Egyptians started getting into the habit of when you extend hands, they say mutwaddi, means I have wudu, and I don't want to negate my wudu by shaking your hands, right? So I don't remember where, but we were somewhere, and my mother was greeting this guy. I think he was a patient, and she extended her hand, and he said mutwaddi, and didn't extend his hand. I never forgot her response. She said, "Well, I am worth redoing your wudu." May Allah bless her soul. It stunned him, and it just remembered it forever. It's like, okay, fine.
a story took place. When we were visiting in Kuwait just maybe a month and a half ago or so, and one of my cousins, he was sitting in a shop, and he sold some merchant, and he was busy handling the phone or something, so he handed the change of the money back to the customer with his left hand. And this quote unquote bearded young man with short dress and short robe said, "No, I will not take it. You are giving it to me in your left hand. How could you do that? You dare to do that?" He said, "Oh, I'm sorry." He put the money in his right hand, and he was trying to give him the change in his right hand. He said, "No, I will not take this change. You have to give me a different change."
That's quite a bid'ah.
Imagine how far these people with do's and don'ts can go to crystallize even the sunnahs wherever they are, whatever they are. They're trying to make it as hard as they can.
I mean, I'm the best. Muhammad al-Ghazali, when it came to shaking hands, the best opinion was articulated by me. He wrote it and he said it. He said, follow the custom of the culture you're in. And because it's an issue of adab, it's an issue of raqa'iq. And raqa'iq are not issues of faith. It's an issue of what cultural practice. So, I mean, I had when I was at the University of Texas, I had a colleague who I had lobbied to get him hired in the department. It was the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. And when he joined, his first, after he was hired, I don't know how it only emerged after he was hired, but, oh, I now remember, because he was hired as a visiting professor first. He refused to shake hands with women. The female colleagues got very offended. And of course, who did they go to? They came to me, like, how, was it, say it, Nizamuddin? It was Nizamuddin, right? Yeah, it was in the year he was in Texas. And his failure to, follow the custom was taken, not just it ended up in him not being hired, but it was taken in a very offensive fashion. It hurt people's feelings. I don't think it's worth it. Now, on the other hand, if you're in a context where that's what you're comfortable with, not shaking hands, and in a context in which it will not be misunderstood and it won't reflect badly on Islam, then don't shake hands. It's a cultural issue. It's an issue of practice and comfort. Like one of the, the practice of kissing by touching nose in Khalij, right?
Yes.
You've seen that, right? It's an entirely cultural thing. Do you touch nose to kiss, or do you don't touch nose to kiss? I am very uncomfortable, with having a man pick noses. You follow the culture.
I'd like to mention something. There's a movie out now called The Insult. I don't know if you've heard about it.
It's a Lebanese.
Yeah.
The nominee for the foreign film.
Yeah.
One of the foreign films.
It's just scary. A Palestinian and Lebanese. And whatever this insult is, it takes place it goes all the way up to the president of Lebanon. And then it has to somehow be diffused and brought back into focus. But I sat there and I didn't quite understand exactly what the cultural underpinnings were. But I was like, each one is saying, no, I will not apologize to the other. It was just
This is fascinating. We've got to see this.
It's a great movie.
Yeah, it's at
Lena Di
Lamb.
Roya.
You saw it?
Well, you know, I saw part of it, and also I spoke.
What
with
was
that.
the insult, do you know?
He actually, the Lebanese guy, they were arguing about something, and he said something about they should have killed off all the Palestinians.
Oh.
Okay, and that was like, you can't go that far. You could have, you could step on my blue suede shoes. You can't do that.
Is it based on actual events, or is it just...
I don't think so. No, but it's worth watching just to see how these two people just. I mean, how do you get the entire country? They ended up in court. And no, I don't want money from him. No, I don't want him to go to jail. I just want him to apologize. Well, I'm not going to apologize. It's amazing.
What a
Just
great
amazing.
metaphor.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, but it's worth seeing.
Of course, the bad thing about moving to Thousand Oaks is that we're away from culture. we live in Thousand Oaks, and it's like it feels like we've moved to the villages, the reef, the.
Wait until you move to Acton. You're right in the moon. You're in no touch with any.
Do people go to bed by 8 o'clock at night?
By this time we're like
Everyone is passed out.
trying
There
to.
is also the German-Turkish film by Fatih Akin called In the Fade, which is about the two white supremacists, husband and wife, who actually kill somebody. And, it's a beautiful story about, which is very, very contemporary.
What is it called again?
In the Fade.
In the film.
They killed a young man, the husband of this woman who is German. He's Turkish and he's Muslim. So they place a bomb in his store where he's working, and he dies with his kid. So this woman, this German woman, they capture the culprits, they capture the supremacists, but during the trial they cannot prove that they are the one. They know they did it, but they don't have enough evidence to convict them, so they are left free. And the wife tracks them down in Greece. It's a beautiful film, very, very powerful. It's one of the four foreign nominations for the Academy Award.
Will you say the name one more time again?
In the Fade.
In the Fade.
And the director is a great Turkish-German director. His name is Fatih Akin.
Yeah.
I love his movies.
Yeah.
They are fantastic.
Can you imagine if the Bosnian genocide involved non-Muslim victims, how many movies would have been made about that? Or now the Rohingyas? I fought Muslims because there's nothing preventing Muslims from going into this field and leaving their mark. I mean, but that mentality, that sort of mentality of because if your brain space is occupied with the right hand and the left hand and so on, it has truly a dumbing effect on your intellect. Your intellect can become shackled and it loses IQ. I think every day your IQ dips lower until you just become pedantic. It is no accident that when the Prophet ﷺ says, خيركم في الجاهلية خيركم في Islam, that the best of you in Jahiliyyah are also the best of you in Islam, and the worst of you in Jahiliyyah are also the worst of you in Islam, is because the nature of men, the Islamic message was revealed among people who despised subservience and despised stupidity. And that's why they met the world with such an open attitude and liberated attitude. It's very different than contemporary Muslims who through various historical processes, whether it's colonialism and then the various despotic paradigms that followed colonialism, have lost the creative impulse. And earlier I think you brought up the point of the Usuli Institute. If I would sum it up in what convinced me to become a part of this, is that to try to reignite the creative impulse wherever it is, wherever it may be, and whoever embodies it, in whatever field.
Can I ask a question? Is there any actual movement going on here in Southern California in regards to the Rohingya in Burma, or?
The only attention that I am aware of is by human rights organizations. I know that there's a Muslim Islamic Relief that basically transports aid to refugees, displaced Rohingyas, but that's but there's very, other than reports that are published every now and then, that's really, that's all.
Did they withdraw the Nobel for Peace to the Prime Minister? Did they, or they didn't? They didn't. But they were talking about.
Yeah, they were talking about it, but it never happened.
They didn't do it.
Although she's completely complicit in the
She didn't say anything.
No, not she continues to defend the army despite the clear. I was reading this last week. They discovered 3 new mass graves, and. You're just, you're stunned. And the committee the commission that I used to be a member of, the U.S. Commission for Religious Freedom, this is the point where you really, see the hypocrisy that is not a word about the plight of Muslims in China or the plight of the Rohingyas. I don't know who the Muslim member that serves on it now, but they got one of those people like Zuhdi or whatever his name is. What's his name? Zuhdi Jasser, yeah. It's like we have an expression that it's like there are people who like to be يضرب على قفاه. How do you translate that? People who are addicted to being smacked on the back of the head as a form of humiliation. Yeah. Unfortunately, there are Muslims like that.
Buttons for punishment?
Yeah, they it's like a monkey performing in a circus for a treat. I know it's very harsh, but it's quite true. And they deserve that, because shame on them for collaborating on a completely Islamophobic enterprise like this. Okay.
Thank you so
Alhamdulillah.
much.
Alhamdulillah.